First, just a quick moment about who I am and what I'm doing here. Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a global market research firm focused exclusively on the clean energy sector. We were founded 7 years ago in London as New Energy Finance, and we were bought by Bloomberg about 2 years ago. There's about 200 of us around the world now in about a dozen countries, and all we do is track investment flows and technology and policy trends in clean energy. So what I'm going to show you today is really the collective wisdom of all of these folks and what we've been doing for 7 years, building a database, trying to track what goes on in this industry. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two things. One, use these slides to kind of give you a quick update on where the market stands today, because I do think it's important to frame this discussion within the here and now of current market dynamics. And then I'll just offer a few off-the-cuff thoughts about this, what we view as a very important idea of a clean trade zone, or whatever you want to call it, some kind of arrangement under which clean energy goods and services can trade across borders in a fairly frictionless manner. And it's an idea that our CEO, Michael Liebreich, has certainly been very supportive of in the past, and I think all of us on our side think that in terms of addressing climate change, this is a critically, potentially important idea, but there are challenges in the short run to trying to implement something like this, and I'm going to talk about those. So first, about the industry. This is the big picture charts, as you'll see, which is basically total new dollars invested into the clean energy sector year by year, dating back to 2004. And what you can see is we saw this very spectacular increase from 2004 up to 2008. 2008 to 2009, a leveling off, no shock there due to the economic downturn. And then 2009 to 2010, a jump from 186 to about $250 billion in new capital invested in the sector, somewhat of a surprise to us for really a couple reasons, which I'll talk about right now. So first has been an amazing increase in the amount of installations of photovoltaics in Europe, and particularly Germany, but also Italy and other countries like the Czech Republic that have had very supportive so-called feed-in tariff programs that have helped really push deployment of PV onto roofs in Europe. And the second has been China and the incredible ramp-up of spending and investment that's gone into that country. Those are the two single biggest reasons, although there are certainly others as well, including the fact that as the economy began to tank in the fourth quarter of 2008 and into Q1 of 2009, many countries around the world really stepped up their support for this sector in the form of clean energy stimulus. We counted about $195 billion in total stimulus commitments from different governments around the world. I actually need to update this chart. We need a new estimate for 2011, but I think we're probably roughly about 85–90% of the way through spending all those funds that have come out of governments, which means that we are starting to hit the end of the road in terms of some of that generous support that's been put out there. One point I would make about the stimulus is that, not surprisingly, I mean, it is stimulus, and it was viewed as an opportunity to use clean energy to create economic growth in various countries around the world. And that was the rationale that has been used by everybody from President Obama to the First Minister of Scotland to officials in Brazil, you name it. This has been a big part of the sort of political math that's been used, which is that you could help build a domestic manufacturing base of wind turbines or solar equipment or whatever it is, and that your country could become a global leader. And that is part of what drove a lot of this. Within the bigger picture, in terms of how much money has actually been spent on clean versus so-called dirty energy, this is from a report we just produced a few months ago with the United Nations. The long story short is the gap is not that big between how much money has been invested last year in new power generation from renewables versus what was invested in new power generation from fossil fuels. The gap has been closing, and it almost doesn't exist anymore. There are a lot of factors involved in this. Part of it is that you have some economies like ours in the US that are not growing that rapidly, so there is not as much of a need to add fossil generation as quickly. But it's also a reflection of the steep increase of deployment of renewables and how fast that's risen. In terms of the markets, one thing I think to think about as we think about this question of free trade and clean energy, the market for clean energy is globally becoming much more diversified. Without walking through every one of these chunks of these charts, the short story, the early days of clean energy was very much defined by Europe, which got out ahead by putting in place carbon caps and programs of that sort and providing heavy supports for the industry. Then came the United States, and then, of course, you can see on the right-hand side this massive ramp up in spending in Asia, mostly China is what that's accounted for. But I think what's also interesting is the Middle East and Africa and South America blocks that you see there. We are increasingly seeing development of clean energy projects in new countries, from places like Turkey to Kenya to Brazil to Chile to Peru, you name it. There is much more diversity. This is something that, frankly, the industry welcomes because, in some cases, the big Western markets are becoming either saturated or policymakers are getting tired of subsidizing the industry so much. And so there needs to be new market development. And some of these countries have outstanding natural resources, of course, as well. So you can build very efficient clean energy projects in them. But this is something to be considered within the larger goal of clean energy trade. I won't walk you through every chunk of this chart, but this is our look that we do every quarter at the so-called levelized cost of energy generation of different technologies. This is essentially saying, okay, if you owned a wind farm or a geothermal plant, how much would you have to sell your power for every year, every megawatt hour for every year for 20 years in order for you to earn what we consider a reasonable 10% return on investment? And the long story short of this chart is down at the bottom you'll see natural gas and coal generation, and the little darker purple chunk that indicates the additional cost if you were to add a carbon cost on there. But in most cases, in most parts of the world, clean energy still doesn't compete and beat dirty energy on a purely unsubsidized basis. We're getting certainly closer, and wind onshore is definitely in the zone, and as I'll show you in a moment, solar is moving very much in the right direction. But generally speaking, if you look at it on this kind of analysis, which frankly, for better or for worse, is the kind of metric that the energy industry typically uses, they tend to view these dirtier sources of energy as beating renewables. Now, like I said, you could discuss whether this is the right rationale, the right way to look at this. There are obviously long-term benefits of any renewable energy project that a fossil project doesn't offer, but this is, by the numbers, where things stand right now. And this is the drop that we've seen in photovoltaic prices. And so, the good news, the sort of bad news about the last chart was that a number of the technologies are not competing and beating dirty energy yet, but they're getting very close. And the good news is that things are generally moving very much in the right direction. So this is the cost of a crystalline silicon photovoltaic module over time. And this even understates it because actually we've seen prices drop even more sharply in just literally the last month. The market moves very, very quickly. The cost of a Chinese solar module now is probably about $1.10 a watt. For a US or a German one, maybe $1.20 a watt. That's off about 40% in the last less than 24 months. And so what's going on in this market is that this technology is rapidly heading towards being much more competitive and around the world. So just to give you a quick example of how we see this potentially playing out. Right now, if you look at last year's levelized cost of energy, which is this blue line, along the left-hand side, you can see the dollar per kilowatt hour price. So this is the price that a residential consumer pays in various countries for their power to come into their house. And then along the bottom, you can see essentially what is a proxy for the intensity of the sun in that particular country, which is kilowatt hours per kilowatt per year. Bottom line is from left to right, you're moving from less sun to more sun. From bottom to top, you're looking at less costly electricity to more costly energy. So right now, these markets essentially are what we would view as in play, meaning that these residential homes, these markets for residential solar, a customer could put a system on their roof without the benefit of any subsidy and essentially get an acceptable return on investment. In other words, there is essentially price parity that started to exist if you live in Hawaii, obviously very high electricity prices but in terrific sun. The same goes for Turkey and for Italy. And then if you were to say, okay, let's lower the price of solar, and this is where we see things going by 2015, what other markets start to become really competitive without subsidies? And it's a lot. It's a lot of interesting big markets. And this is where the sort of real growth and explosive potential is for photovoltaics and why this industry, frankly, is so exciting. And finally, this is a look at the United States. If you took out California, and interestingly enough, China. China is doing a tremendous amount to build up its manufacturing base for clean energy equipment, but in reality, for photovoltaics, it's not necessarily a great market for actually deploying that equipment. So two things have driven down these costs. One, we have seen a traditional so-called learning curve in clean energy, in particular in solar, where the more you manufacture, the more prices come down. Much like Moore's law in semiconductors, the same can be applied. So we've seen that drop over time. But now, in the short run, we have another dynamic, which is affecting, frankly, all the major clean energy markets right now, which is substantial overcapacity. There are two lines you see here, the light blue line and the sort of pale purple line. Those are our two attempts, and I would say attempts because it's very difficult to predict what the demand will be for photovoltaics over the next several years. And then the bars you see are supply. So even in our optimistic higher line of expected demand, supply far exceeds, or I should say capacity far exceeds what would be the expected demand. And this is putting real pressure on prices. Like I said, even in the last month, we've seen the price drop very sharply. So if you look out in terms of projecting out for a utility scale price for PV, the price of a large scale project, we're maybe at about $275 a watt right now, and we expect that to drop by about half over the next 10 years or so. And again, this really drives towards cost competitiveness for this sector without subsidies. The story for wind is not all that different in some ways, although it has its unique factors, and certainly I know Peter will talk a little bit about this from the Vestas perspective, but we are also in a situation of overcapacity in this market, thanks in part, again, to China and the amount of new capacity that they have brought online. So on a global basis, you can see far more capacity available than we project to be demanded. It's a little more tricky than solar in the sense that it's very expensive to move a massive wind turbine from one side of the world to the other. So there's a lot of local markets, and you need to look at it on a more localized basis. But I think the point still remains that we are seeing general oversupply in this market. And then finally, more or less the same story for lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles, which you can see declared annual demand, which means actual contracts signed that we've tracked. And you can see annualized supply capacity far exceeding that. So these are all the general factors that we're seeing in the industry. One, a strong support for the sector from governments, often in the name of economic development and energy security, with much less of an emphasis on the sort of environmental attributes of clean energy. And two, rapidly dropping costs as a result of market dynamics. So with that in mind, just a few final quick thoughts about why we're supportive of this idea, but also some of the sort of inherent limitations or challenges, I should say, that at least I view existing today. One, it is, in our view, obviously in the collective interest of everybody who worries about climate change to drive costs down as quickly as possible. So that you can speed deployment as quickly as possible, and you can start to deal with the problem of climate change and emissions as quickly as possible. I mean, this room, everybody here may take this for granted, but not everybody obviously in Washington takes this for granted. But this is a basic idea which I think is fundamental to this concept of some kind of a free trade zone or administration or whatever it would be. Frictionless trade is something that I think is really in the collective interest of the world. As I showed a moment ago, clean energy technologies in some parts of the world are truly competitive now without subsidies, and in other parts of the world they're not yet. But we're heading in the right direction. We're really very much within sight of the goal. We're very close. And so what could knock you off course would be some kind of an international trade war or the imposition of major tariffs that do not allow those prices to continue to go down. We have seen what I would say is maybe even the opening, maybe not a salvo, but certainly the opening signs of increasing trade tensions between various countries, in particular between the US and China on these issues. And one thing that could be the result of that would be to hamper, like I said, the decline in prices. And the long-term effect of that could be very negative. So the challenge, of course, is the politics. In the short run, a lot of these countries, as I've mentioned, have used the rhetoric of economic development to justify massive spending in various stimulus programs, whether it's in the US or wherever it is. And that frankly, these politicians have got a lot baked into this. They've got a lot on the line to have their countries become the domestic manufacturing hub for whatever it is, whatever technology it is that they think that they can be the leader in. For instance, Scotland is very keen on being a leader in marine technology. The United States wants to be solar and wind and others. These are going to be difficult positions for anybody to back out of. And the challenge of creating a true free trade arrangement means that you have to come to terms with the fact that perhaps you're not going to be the winner in one particular manufacturing area. And that's not easy for political leaders to come to terms with always. So this is the short-term challenge of this. I would argue that in the long run, where we'll go is that at some point countries will realize that not everybody can be the global leader in manufacturing this or that or the other. But there are tremendous economic opportunities that come with low-cost equipment wherever that gets manufactured. So for instance, in the United States, Chinese equipment is 10 cents cheaper per watt than American-made, or more specifically, German-made equipment. And that 10-cent watt can make all the difference between the level of deployment that you have in Southern California and Arizona and other places like that, and the number of jobs that could get created as a result. So I think there needs to be a bit of a maturing in discussion about the economic development opportunities and the long-term benefits that could come from free trade of clean energy goods and services. So with that, I will hand it back and say thank you very much for your time.
Okay. So I think Ethan has made an excellent case from the market's perspective by providing us with the context of where we are, and then why it now, at this time, seems to make sense to remove barriers to create more robust and efficient markets in renewable energies. I think what I'm going to do is add a couple of sort of comments and to the question of context and challenges of why this is the case now, and then move immediately into a very brief presentation, even though you'll see several slides there, but I'll do it very briefly, on the trade aspects of this whole thing. Let's see, how do I change? Just, this one. Okay. Sorry. This one. Okay, so just very briefly. So the two I think drivers on moving faster and to a higher scale in the use of renewable energies for us have to do, on one hand, sort of the upper left corner there, with the question of access to energy. So we still have a world where 1.6 billion people, more or less, have no access to modern forms of energy. And the question is then, what type of energy supply can we then give to these people? And so again, ideally, from a sustainable development perspective, we would think that they should be clean energy technologies. Then on the lower corner down here, from the International Energy Agency, you have sort of the case for that comes from the imperative to do something from the emissions perspective. And so what you see there very, very briefly, and I like this graph particularly because it's so much in sort of in our face, how big the gap is. What you see in the red curve there is the current policy scenario. So we continue to move on current use of energies. That's the sort of emissions that we will get by 2035. On the blue line, what you have is sort of where we would get if the pledges that were made in Copenhagen are then really met. And the green one down there is really where we need to go. And so you see how incredibly huge that gap is. And again, we know that it's not all the gains that we can make in reducing emissions are not all going to come from renewable energies. So most of you are familiar with this. Here what you see is a projection to 2050 on the sources of energy. And more or less 70% of those sources will continue to be, even by that time, 2050, will come from fossil fuels. And it's only a few. What you have in the graph is really sort of the green, orange, and yellow that will come from renewable energies. But still, in order to get there on renewable energies, there needs to be some sort of boost so that we can get to that kind of mix. The biggest, it doesn't escape anybody, particularly economists, that the biggest sort of race here in terms of competitiveness is renewable energies versus the fossil fuels that don't internalize the cost of emissions. And that on top of that are subsidized, both on the consumption and the production ends. So the last sort of slide quickly on that context. What you have on the upper graph there, again, is sort of the gains that we could get from renewables, and those are illustrated in the green and then the purple zone there. That above that is really from energy efficiency. So again, we are talking mostly in this paper and today about removing barriers for strong markets, more efficient markets, for a scale up in the use of renewables. But we also know that energy efficiency is the other place where we can put our efforts to try to generate more gains. There is also a case to intervene on trade and with trade tools for energy efficiency. It's just a much more complex case, and I can talk about this later when we go into some discussions. Now, the question of the driver, of what really drives the push of renewable energies, it's one that is sort of it gets you into very heated arguments with experts. And so Ethan said before, it's really economic interest that has pushed these new policies, particularly in the US. In some other places, I guess particularly in Europe, it has to do really with the motivation to do something about emissions. We know from, this is an exercise that we did with the European Patent Office, where we review patent documents in about 80 offices, so 70 million patent documents around the world, to try to classify those patents that have to do with clean energy technologies as a proxy to innovation on clean energy technologies and to investment in innovation. And what we found that the blue line that you see there is the filing of patents on selected clean energy technologies versus the lower sort of purplish line, which refers to fossil and nuclear energy, and the green line, which is all other technical fields. What you see that surge in the blue line coincides with the discussions on the Kyoto Protocol and then the coming into being of the Kyoto Protocol. We have some more detail of how that happened, but it's very interesting how those discussions at the international level on climate change resulted immediately in such a surge in patents and innovation in that area. So again, I'm just using that as an indicator again of how this driver of clean energy the driver of clean energy may come really from the climate change perspective. So before, in the introduction, I was talking about sort of the mapping exercise that we got into at ICTSD. This is just sort of an illustration of the process that we undertook to do this mapping. I won't get you into the details of that, but basically the difficulty here was to try to classify the components of clean energy technology equipment and do it at the most disaggregated level. So we did it mostly at 6-digit levels in the harmonized code, but we went in some cases into 8 and 10. Now, when you do that, you move from thinking, as I sort of using a very simplified example, but you instead of talking about moving a wind energy turbine between two jurisdictions, when you do this disaggregation, you're talking about 147 or 150 something components that would move between very many jurisdictions in order to generate that final product. So that disaggregation is absolutely essential to try to understand what are the production and trade opportunities that are presented to many countries at different levels of development when you generate these markets for renewable energy. In a conversation that I had with Peter's CEO in Copenhagen, he was telling me of an anecdote in Australia where Vestas is deploying a large project of windmills. And the Australians had to obviously grapple, like many people are doing now, between prioritizing policy objectives. And so is it about producing the parts and the components for the windmills in Australia, or is it really about introducing renewable energies at such a scale that it does make a difference in terms of emissions? At the end, they went for this introduction at a massive scale. Vestas was willing to do either go with the local components or go with production from China. And the Australian government, in an enlightened and very probably rare situation, they decided that they would go with prioritizing this other policy objective, which is a basis for the argument we're making here. I personally come to all this work convinced that governments need absolute clarity of purpose when they put in front these policies and measures. And with this situation of whether it's about jobs, it's about industrial policy, or is it about renewable energies, in the real world, it's terribly complex, of course, but it should be, there should be, again, a case made for the need to the rapid scale-up and the massive scale-up that could lead governments to move away from that dichotomy and that discussion. So very quickly on trade. So what we know, and Ethan just said it before as well, is that domestic sustainable and trade policies, directly or indirectly, could facilitate or constrain trade in sustainable energy goods and services, all those components of those technologies, and help or hinder supply chain optimization, efficiencies, and then get us into the kind of scenarios that we need deploying sustainable energy technologies. We know from the work that we have done that the distribution in terms of the producers of these components and these parts, either for photovoltaic cells or for wind turbines or any other forms of clean energy technologies, is very spread out. It continues to be somewhat concentrated in a few countries, but it's quite spread out. So we have done sort of similar exercises to this one for various components, and what we found out again is that if you disaggregate to 6 and to 8 digits, then you find that there is a big space for participation. We also know that when it comes to barriers at the border, tariffs do matter. They're not the main factor in decisions about trade in these components, but there's some interesting, the landscape again is quite interesting, and there are some countries that continue to keep very high tariffs in a number of components and for some of these technologies. So there are policies, domestic policies and regulations that would have trade effects and some that would not. This is just sort of a list of some of this, a selection of policies. It obviously depends on design. I won't go in detail on that. Some of them will have a trade impact. They're very, very obvious, obviously related to trade, tariffs, export restrictions and export taxes, market access for sustainable energy service providers, measures affecting national treatment for sustainable energy service providers, trade facilitation and transit measures, and local content requirements, which has become a very popular measure in several places, including OECD countries most recently. There are also some of these measures that have no foreseeable trade impact and that do have a great incidence in, again, as incentives in the deployment of these technologies, such as government assistance for business development, R&D, subsidies, power purchase agreements, and so on. Now, in terms of the gap in governance of these trade issues, doing the analysis of the WTO provisions, what we found is that there is ambiguity and inadequacy in many of the provisions. This is not surprising because obviously the agreements in the WTO were not written thinking about this kind of world in which we are, and specifically questions related to clean energy technologies. So there have been a number of propositions about what to do with this. We staged a dialogue recently at the WTO where Thomas Gauthier came up with a proposal to create a framework agreement on energy within the WTO. We have suggested something a bit more modest that looks specifically at some of these issues related to clean energy technology. This is one of the biggest questions that we would have as we move into the next stage of this project, is the question of definition and scope of clean energy technologies, and then the kind of coverage that we want to give from a provisions perspective. So, for instance, a framework agreement on energy would obviously take on the subsidies provided to fossil fuels, perhaps. It would probably take on issues related to transit. It would take in issues related to electricity trade, cross-border, and so on. If you keep to clean energy technologies, then it would probably be a more contained and type of agreement that really looks at what kind of trade tools could be used to enhance these markets. So going through some of these provisions, there are provisions in the investment, trade-related investment measures, and the subsidies agreement, the various articles of GATT, the global procurement agreement, the technical barriers to trade, agreement on services that would relate to these issues on energy. They're right now being challenged in a way and being tried by the few cases that are coming into the WTO. We expect more to come. We have a paper that should also be distributed to anybody interested here on that looks into feed-in tariffs, the various schemes that governments are using, and then their compatibility to WTO, sort of building on the case of the Ontario schemes and the Japan-Canada contention there. But what is clear to everybody, and again in dialogues, we've staged some 9 dialogues now in the past 2 years with WTO delegates and other experts looking at these issues. What is clear to everybody is that the provisions are not adequate to deal with the kind of challenges that governments are dealing with right now. Well, the question of NTVs, again, I just sort of sketch some examples there of what sort of NTVs are now again being used and how the rules relate to them. Some of the Doha negotiations, the issues discussed there, would have to do with some of these issues, but then again Doha is stalled. And to a great extent, this proposition to look into a plurilateral agreement on these issues is part of a bigger sort of thinking of where do we go with the multilateral trade system, and the need for the multilateral trade system to start embracing the possibility of plurilaterals, of clubs of being something like a club of clubs that could move things forward instead of leaving them stalled. In particularly those pressing issues that are coming up. So sustainable trade agreement on energy would have, again, there will be issues related to venue, architecture, pathways that would be very important to define in advance, because it would be very different to go follow this course or the other course. 3 that we have sort of looked at in the paper that you have are the idea of an ITA type. So for those of you that follow the WTO, is the Information Technologies Agreement within the WTO framework. So this is an agreement where all the members, that the benefits are extended beyond the members of the agreement. So the benefits are on an MFN basis. The agreement is triggered once there is a critical mass that is reached, or certain thresholds that are defined. So there's the issue of free riders here. On the question of clean energy technologies, a big difficulty of going that way would be to define those thresholds. Are we talking about critical mass in the production of those technologies, or critical mass from the perspective of emissions, or what exactly? And again, those issues would need to be further investigated. A second type of agreement could be what we call a GPA type. So the agreement is similar to the government procurement agreement in the WTO, where you have benefits only exclusively for members of the agreement. It operates on the basis of a waiver in the case of the GPA a waiver that was negotiated and agreed in Marrakech at the time of the WTO launch, but one that is not impossible to obtain, again, depending on the politics involved. That type of agreement, again, would have pros and cons. And then there's the possibility, and again, this goes together with these ideas of what do we do with the multilateral trade system moving forward, of thinking about a plurilateral or multilateral agreement outside the WTO framework. So the idea of a plurilateral trade agreement could, for instance, be along the lines of the ACTA that has been negotiated recently on issues related to intellectual property by a number of southern and northern governments. It includes a few governments. It's outside of the WTO, but it's built on WTO norms and principles so that in the future it could be folded under the WTO. That's something that, again, sovereign states are free to do at any time. Get together a coalition of willing and just move forward on the basis of that plurilateral. A multilateral outside the WTO, some of the people that have been exposed to this idea have reacted, particularly from the environmental perspective, comparing this to CITES or Basel or the Montreal Protocol, and deciding that if this is set up as an agreement that is required, again, based on the question of the imperative of reducing emissions in the context of addressing climate change, then you can come up with an agreement that has this trade-specific type of obligations, but that is completely outside of the WTO framework. So those are different, again, venues, architecture, and pathways that could be explored. Again, there are details there in the paper, and maybe through the discussion we can go through some of them. Let me just, someone mentioned before about dispute settlement and well, the issues related to the legality of any of these pathways in terms of the compatibility with the WTO. We're already working on a paper in this respect of what is possible, what's not possible, what are the options legally to make an agreement like this compatible. And again, those are issues that would need further investigation. But what I'd like to do is stop there. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of technical background to all this. You have some of that in that paper, that background paper, and I just invite more of a discussion as we go through the day. So thank you all very much.
Well, very briefly, repeating material which I think everybody here knows, is that the environmental goods and services negotiations, like much else in Doha, are stalled, though there's been a lot of talk. The seeming difficulty is to agree on a single environmental goods and services list, but behind that is that many members of the WTO really don't have much interest in the environmental goods and services agenda. As Ricardo laid out, there are a lot of issues that underlie an improvement in our CO2 emissions profile, that is reducing the CO2 emissions profile. And many countries would say, well, trade in environmental goods and services is not the most important, which may be true. But mercantilism, of course, remains the dominant way of thinking by negotiators in the WTO context, and several WTO members, which are important members, seriously protect some or a wide variety of environmental goods and services defined by various lists in their home markets, and they're pretty reluctant to liberalize, especially if those countries, again, turning back to something that Ethan said, are not the world leaders in anything, in fact, are not really competitive exporters. So there has been some exploration of an agreement based on bilateral, plurilateral, or regional, and I named some of the countries which are have been involved in those talks. But again, the list issue has been a daunting obstacle. The WTO has a report, and it's cited there, which lists 408 tariff lines. It's well worth looking at it because this was a compilation from any country which wanted to suggest something. It's at the 6-digit level, and they have these various headings which are enumerated there for the assorted products. Most products on that 408 of those 408 tariff lines at the 6-digit level have multiple environmental aspects. I mean, they might be water treatment plus waste management and other combinations. So what we did, that's Jason, Kim, and I, what we did was decided to strip down to just a very modest core of products that might conceivably be a launch pad for a sustainable energy trade agreement. A launch pad, not the final after 10 years, but what might just get it going. And so we looked at the WTO list and we chose 39 environmental goods. We gave up on the services. That's been quite contentious. Just environmental goods at the 6-digit level, which are 32 of those are the sole category of renewable energy, and there are 6 that are renewable energy in one other category, and then we added, for political balance, ethanol, which everyone knows is a big issue. So that was our group to look at intensively. And if we take these 39 products, in the year 2010, world imports were about 225 billion, and it's a very small percentage of world imports of all products, about 2%. And the photovoltaic cells are by far the largest. That was mentioned by Ethan. He had good trade slides there. Now, if we look at which we did, the MFN bound rates, the MFN applied rates, and the effective applied rates, they vary quite widely. If you take the trade-weighted average for all 39 environmental goods, they're really in line with all industrial products, but of course there's quite a wide range. And photovoltaic have pretty low rates on the whole, and that was shown in one of the charts that Ricardo had up there. When you go to ethanol, of course, it tends to be very high, and not just in the United States, which I think everybody realizes, but there is a slide which showed that India is way up at 150%. Our figure for the United States includes an attempt at measuring the specific duty. The applied rates are, of course, a little bit lower than the maximum bound rates. And when we, instead, just on a terminology, when we say effective applied rates, that means including preferential arrangements between countries, of which there are a great many, whereas MFN applied rates, of course, does not have any preferential arrangements built into those figures. So then we went down and asked, well, who might join this agreement, recognizing all the difficulties that the WTO has had in the Doha. And some of us have, and I think it's a growing number, have been on the notion that the way after Doha, whatever happens in terms of wrapping up Doha, is towards plurilateral agreements, which are plurilateral agreements of the nature of the government procurement agreement. That is to say, the benefits are not extended to non-members, or at least not extended immediately, where immediate might be a 10-year period. So that was, I believe, Ricardo's middle slide when he looked at the possible ways you could negotiate one. Well, that's our list of potential core countries. So you could say it's more than 10 countries because we're including NAFTA and the European Union, but the other countries are countries which have indicated, which either have low tariffs or have indicated a general interest in freer trade. And then we have candidate countries, which are important, big, emerging countries, which we would hope, if anything like this got going, might, after a period of time, join in. Now, several of the candidate countries protect these 39 really core products to a much higher extent than the core countries, as the slide which Ricardo put up indicated. And we have the details. The reference to the tables are the tables in the paper, which if you're interested, you can take a look at. The interesting here is China. China is a very notable exception to the what we call candidate countries, emerging countries. It has really quite low tariffs on imports of these products. So that makes it for a very interesting political dynamic. Now, we would emphasize, Jason and I would emphasize, these designations are very illustrative and tentative, looking at a possible launch pad. Now, several of the environmental goods already have low tariffs, as already mentioned, but the one which sticks out for a high tariffs, even among some of the core countries, is ethanol. So the low tariff products, you would think there would be no great difficulty in negotiating, but the reciprocal of that, which is recognized by trade experts in this room, of whom there are many, is no pain, no gain. I mean, when you start calculating the benefits in equivalent variation terms, kind of a phrase which nobody understands except economists, or welfare, which is another term which doesn't convey the right idea, or just straight gross domestic product gains, when you cut the tariffs on low tariff products, well, of course, the gains aren't going to be very large. It's not much cheaper to consumers. You're not going to get many scale economies. Variety will not be expanded. All the channels which free trade invokes are not very large when you have low tariffs already, but it's a start in terms of creating a pact. As mentioned earlier, or as referenced earlier, confining the benefits to the agreement members, that's controversial. To have something like the government procurement agreement. Now, again, as Ricardo mentioned, there is the article in the Marrakesh Agreement, I believe it's Article 11.3, which led to the Annex 4 of 4 agreements, which at that time, that's back in 1994, were on a plurilateral basis. 2 of them have now expired, dairy and bovine. Civil aviation is, that's tied up in, that's also been denounced, we could put it that way. And so you have government procurement, which is the remaining one from that era. An Article 11.3 agreement requires consent of 3/4 of WTO members to be within the WTO framework. As mentioned, it could be outside the WTO framework, like ACTA or whatever, CITES. So there are 2 different paths, but within the WTO framework is the path that we are envisaging. Why would the countries which don't agree with this, don't want to sign on immediately, why would they agree to vote for in favor of a waiver which enables an agreement? I think there are 2 parts to the bargain. One is that one part of it, which goes way beyond SETA, is the notion that some of the countries which are not too enthusiastic about the Doha results so far, including the U.S., might agree to accept many of those results if the path was then free to go forward with plurilaterals. So that might bring many of the other 100 countries which like what's on the Doha plate to vote in favor, which is pretty much the same bargain which existed at Marrakesh with respect to government procurement and the other 3 plurilaterals at the time. The other is that, well, there are many countries which today might not be in favor of liberalizing the way a sustainable energy agreement would contemplate, but would see they'd like to join it later, and if it's in the WTO framework, the accession possibility would be greater than if it's outside. We here just list some of the top partners. They're all in the tables. I don't think there are probably big surprises here. But the bullet I would emphasize is the one about China. China is a big exporter. It's low tariffs. One might think that it would join, at least so far as tariffs are concerned, but there is the issue, which we don't address in this version of the paper, though we will look at it in the next version, and we'll be informed by the discussion today. If the agreement contemplates doing anything about eliminating local content requirements or harmonizing standards and talking about subsidies and so forth, those dimensions would probably give China more reason to pause. Well, we found that the total imports of these 39 environmental goods were about 102 billion, not counting the intra-NAFTA and intra-EU imports. And I have some other figures here, but the only way you get to close to a critical mass is you count the intra-NAFTA and intra-EU imports, and then you count the imports of all the 39 environmental goods and so forth, and you can get up to about 78% of world imports of all 39 environmental goods. And if that's good enough to call it a critical mass, if that's important for negotiating purposes, you're not to the 90% level, but you're reasonably close. But when you look at just the trade between the countries counting NAFTA as one and EU as one, well, you don't quite get there. But for the candidate countries that I mentioned earlier, their commercial interest in joining sooner rather than later is because of the export markets that they would then access for those countries which have more or one or more product lines which are competitive. To be honest, the candidate-to-candidate trade flows right now are pretty modest, and we have the numbers there. They're not zero, and South-South trade is growing, as we all know, but it's, at this stage, fairly modest. So now, turning quickly to the conclusions, we think, and this is informed by the great difficulties of getting progress in Doha, that maybe a small or a short list would better serve as a launch pad, and starting with tariffs and putting the other issues into the future. But certainly if this ever got launched, one would look to an expansion, and the conditions for expansion, both in terms of products and in terms of subjects, that's an important negotiating detail. Otherwise it gets frozen in place. And so we say the non-tariff barrier component has to be addressed, certainly with a view to phasing out. And there's another possibility which we throw in here. Even if the SETA concept doesn't get launched as a WTO plurilateral, it might be embedded in the TPP or other regional agreements which are now being launched. In other words, go faster with renewable energy products, and also go broader in terms of not only tariffs but non-tariff barriers. Thanks very much.